HOA nightmare. They tore down my fence, so I exposed their secrets. I should have known the moment Margaret Callaway's shadow fell across my freshly mowed lawn that trouble was brewing. A storm of epic proportions aimed squarely at my doorstep. It was late afternoon, the kind of Texas afternoon where the heat clings to you like a second skin, suffocating and relentless. I just dragged myself home from a soul-crushing day of patching up someone else's drywall, still gritty with dust and the weight of Dallas traffic, when I saw her, Margaret Callaway, clipboard clutched like a weapon, her plastic smile stretched so tight it looked ready to crack, stood in my driveway. Margaret had always radiated that viperous southern charm, the kind that could deliver a cutting insult wrapped in honeyed words, leaving you wondering if you should tank out or run screaming. As president of the Homeowners Association, she ruled Maplewood Estates with an iron fist, a self-appointed queen reigning over a kingdom built on meticulously manicured lawns and ridiculously specific paint swatches. Daniel, she purred, her voice smooth as molasses, but laced with something sharp and dangerous. We need to talk about your fence. My gaze flicked to the fence in question. Just weeks earlier, I'd wrestled with rotting, dilapidated boards, replacing them with sturdy cedar, a barrier that was not only a vast improvement but undeniably within the established guidelines. What about it? I asked, exhaustion already warring with a rising tide of irritation. She made a clucking, sympathetic noise, tilting her head with practiced concern. It doesn't meet community standards. Daniel, I'm afraid. I rubbed her hand across my face, the grit under my fingernails a reminder of the day's labor. I was too hot, too tired, too done for this charade. Margaret, I followed the guidelines to the letter. Her smile tightened, and for a fleeting moment, the real Margaret flickered through that cold, condescending gaze she reserved for those she deemed beneath her, a prelude to reminding them, in no uncertain terms, who held the power in this neighborhood. I'm afraid the board disagrees, she said, each word dripping with condescension. My eyes narrowed, drifting across the street to her own property. Her fence, a monstrosity of wrought iron and towering brick, stood taller and code allowed, a blatant violation of the neutral wood stain supposedly required for all residents. It had been that way for years. What about yours? I challenged, my voice dangerously low. Margaret's smile didn't even flicker. Oh, mine's grandfathered in, dear. And in that instant, I knew with chilling certainty that this wasn't about policy. This was about control, about flexing her power and reminding me, a relative newcomer, of my place. A week later, the inevitable arrived, the official notice. Violation of Homeowners Association policy, non-compliant fence subject to removal. My blood ran cold, driven by a furious determination. I pulled up the Homeowners Association guidelines, highlighting in every single section that proved I was within my rights. I filed an appeal, a formal declaration of war against her petty tyranny. I showed up to the next meeting, armed with evidence, pointing out a half-dozen other homes with fences similar to mine, some even taller, all conveniently ignored. Margaret barely let me finish before she shut me down, her voice laced with ice. The board has already made its decision. The rest of the members, a gaggle of her longtime friends and loyal sycophants, nodded along in unison, their faces blank masks of complicity. No one dared challenge her, not publicly, not in her kingdom. Then, one afternoon, I returned home from another grueling day, my muscles are aching, and found it. Gone. My fence, just gone, ripped from the earth, the posts torn from the ground as if they had never existed. The cedar boards, the nails, everything hauled away, leaving behind only raw, bare earth, a gaping wound in my yard, a symbol of her blatant abuse of power. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space. My hands clenched so tight my knuckles ached. Margaret had sent a crew to remove it, without my permission, without even a warning. Fueled by a rage I could barely contain, I marched across the street, knocking on her door with a force that rattled the windows. When she answered, she wore that same polished smile, that same infuriating air of untouchable authority. You destroy my property. I spat, my voice tight with barely controlled anger. Margaret sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation, as if I were a misbehaving child throwing a tantrum. It was in violation. Daniel, you had every opportunity to correct it. I did everything by the book. The board disagreed, she said, her voice a smooth, dismissive curse. I stared at her, speechless. The audacity, the sheer, unshakable nerve of this woman. For the first time since moving to Maplewood Estates, I felt a burning, visceral hatred for this place, for this woman, for the petty tyranny she represented. I spent the next few weeks digging, fueled by righteous fury. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years, and in that time, she'd made plenty of enemies, leaving a trail of resentment in her wake. She was the reason a retired couple down the street had been forced to sell their home after being fined into oblivion for a mailbox that wasn't the exact shade of beige. She was the reason a single mother had to repaint her house twice because the color looked different in the sunlight. deemed unacceptable by Margaret's all-seeing eye. Then there was her house, a veritable monument to hypocrisy. The fence was just a start. She had an illegal backyard shed that violated property lines, a guest house she had built without permits, a driveway extension that wasn't approved by the city. She had broken every rule in the book while ruthlessly enforcing them on everyone else. So, I did the one thing she never expected. I report every single one of her violations. Not to the board, not to her friends, but directly to the city. The inspectors came a week later. I wasn't home when they arrived, but I heard from my gleeful neighbors that Margaret had stormed out of her house, screaming at them, waving her clipboard like a talisman that could ward off reality. By the end of the week, she had been slapped with thousands of dollars in fines. The guest house was deemed illegal and ordered for removal. The driveway extension torn up. I waited for the retaliation, for another notice, another bogus complaint. Instead, Margaret went silent, a silence as ominous as a gathering storm. Then, at the next homeowners association meeting, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I stood up, cleared my throat, and laid it all out. Years of selective enforcement, how personal vendettas, how blatant misuse of homeowners association funds because, oh yes, I found that too. I looked around the room at the faces of the people she had ruled over for years, their expressions a mixture of shock, anger, and a glimmer of hope. Is this really who you want running your neighborhood? I asked, my voice ringing with conviction. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken resentments. Margaret sat stiff-backed in her chair, her face carefully blank, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped the armrests. She knew. 10 minutes later, Margaret Callaway was removed as Homeowners Association president, ousted from her throne in a landslide vote. Just like that. But as I left the meeting that night, walking out into the humid Texas air, something nagged at me. People like Margaret don't go down quietly. And sure enough, the very next morning, I saw it. A notice taped to my door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore it down, my eyes scanning the words. Violation of community standards, immediate action required. A slow, cold danger settled in my chest. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I crumpled the notice in my fist, staring at my door where it had been taped like some official decree. Immediate action required. The words burned into my brain. Margaret was out as Homeowners Association president, but that didn't mean she was powerless. It meant she still had influence. It wasn't over. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. She didn't have the authority anymore. She couldn't personally enforce rules, which meant she had someone else doing it for her. Jason Whitmore, Margaret's second in command, her loyal lapdog, her yes man. I should have expected it. He had been just as bad, always lurking at her side, nodding along, co-signing every ridiculous fight, every petty complaint. Now that she had been ousted, he was the one pulling the strings. I went straight to the Homeowners Association office. It wasn't much, just a small converted unit in the community center, furnished with an outdated desk and a printer that probably jammed more often than it worked. Jason was there, hunched over paperwork like he actually had something important to do. When I walked in, he didn't even look up. Jason, I said, tossing the crumpled notice onto his desk. He sighed dramatically, finally glancing at me. Afternoon, Daniel. Cut the ball. I snapped. What is this? He smoothed the paper out, scanning it as if he hadn't personally signed it. Looks like a compliance notice. For what? Jason shrugged, his eyes carefully avoiding mine. Routine inspection. I clenched my jaw, fighting to control my temper. My fence was already dealt with. There's nothing else to inspect. Jason leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. He was enjoying this, the power shift, the chance to finally be in control. The new complaint isn't about your fence. That threw me. Then what? He made a vague gesture. Your yard, your exterior upkeep, just some things that don't meet community standards. I let out a bitter laugh. Are you serious? You're nitpicking my lawn now? Jason gave me a slow, deliberate look. The rules apply to everyone. Daniel, you of all people should appreciate that. I saw it then, the smug satisfaction in his face. Margaret might have been officially removed, but she was still very much present, still pulling strings, still finding ways to retaliate. And Jason, he was more than happy to be her puppet. The next few weeks were hell. It started small, with petty, insignificant notices about the length of my grass, the placement of my trash bins, the color of my front door, things that had never been an issue before, things that weren't issues for anyone else. Then came the inspections. People from the board started showing up, walking my property, peering into windows, as if I was under criminal investigation. I'd come home from work and find them jotting down notes, measuring God knows what. One afternoon, I caught up with them in my backyard, clipboard in hand, whispering to each other. I stormed out the back door, my anger finally boiling over. Do you want to explain why the hell you're trespassing? They jumped, exchanging quick looks before one of them, Nancy Bishop, one of Margaret's longtime cronies, cleared her throat. Just conducting an exterior evaluation of my backyard. I shot back, incredulous. She straightened her shoulders, all self-importance. The Homeowners Association has the right to assess properties for compliance. Not without notice. Not without permission. The other one, Paul Hastings, puffed out his chest. We tried to get the hell off my property. I snarled, my voice dangerously low. They scurried away, but the message was clear. They weren't just trying to enforce rules. They were trying to find something, anything, to use against me. And then, one morning, I woke up to find a fresh complaint taped to my door. Non-compliant exterior modifications, immediate correction required. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. Modifications? What modifications? I hadn't touched a damn thing. I walked the perimeter of my house, looking for anything they could have twisted into a violation. And that's when I saw it, a single, thin crack in my driveway. It had been there since I moved in. Barely noticeable, just an old stress fracture in the concrete. But now it was apparently an issue. I could almost hear Margaret's voice in my head. That same sweetly condescending tone. The rules applied to everyone. Daniel. I thought back, of course. I gathered photos, documented every other house in the neighborhood with similar cracks, unkempt yards, peeling paint, all conveniently ignored by the Homeowners Association. I went to meetings. I filed counter complaints. None of it mattered. Every time I challenged a notice, another one appeared. It was deliberate. It was personal. It wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about wearing me down, about breaking me. And then, one day, I came home to find a city inspector's car parked outside my house. That was when I knew things had just taken a turn for the worse. The city inspector's car sent a cold wave of fury coursing through my veins. This wasn't just petty Homeowners Association harassment anymore. Margaret and Jason had escalated. I walked up to my driveway, forcing myself to stay calm. The inspector, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a receding hairline, looked up from his notes as I approached. You the homeowner, Daniel Reeves, I said, extending my hand. What's this about? Got a report about some non-compliant structures on the property, he said, flipping a page in his clipboard. I laughed, a short, mirthless sound. Let me guess, cracks in my driveway. The inspector glanced at me, then at the pavement. That's part of it. I crossed my arms. And what's the other part? He hesitated before answering, like he already knew how ridiculous it was. A concern about unapproved exterior modifications. I exhaled sharply, barely holding back my frustration. There are no modifications. Nothing has changed. He shrugged, like he'd heard that before, then walked around my property, taking notes, snapping a few pictures. When he was done, he tucked his pen behind his ear and gave me a tired look. Between you and me, he said, lowering his voice, this is a waste of my time. I get calls like this, petty complaints from homeowners associations, all the time, meant to harass people. But I have to follow up. So, what now? I asked. You'll get a report in a few weeks. If there's nothing serious, you're fine. But he gave me a knowing look. If they keep filing complaints, the city has to keep sending us out. I gritted my teeth. That was exactly their plan. Margaret and Jason wanted to drown me in so many inspections, fines, and complaints that I'd either bend to their will or sell my house and leave. But I wasn't going anywhere. In fact, I was about to turn the tables on them in a way they never saw coming. I spent the next week doing nothing but research. I dug into every homeowners association document, every city zoning law, every permit issued to Maplewood Estates in the last 20 years. I spent hours at City Hall, sifting through public records, taking notes, making copies. And that's when I hit gold. Margaret and Jason had screwed up badly. First, I found that Margaret's backyard guest house had never been built to code. She had bribed the former Homeowners Association president years ago to look the other way, but the permits were never properly filed with the city. Second, Jason, who had taken over the Homeowners Association, had been misusing Homeowners Association funds. He had approved landscaping work for his own house and charged it to the association. He had written off personal expenses, including a new air conditioning system, as community repairs. And the best part, all of it was illegal. I compiled every single document, every misfiled permit, every financial discrepancy. I sent it all to the city, the county, and to every single homeowner in the neighborhood. It started with Margaret. City inspectors arrived at her house one morning, this time with an official notice of violation. Her guest house, unpermitted. Her fence, non-compliant. Her property taxes, incorrectly filed. She thought, of course. She argued, threatened, screamed. But the city didn't care. She was fined thousands of dollars and given a strict deadline to demolish the illegal structure. She tried to rally the board to defend her, but Jason had his own problems. Because 2 days later, the treasurer called to an emergency meeting. I made sure I was there, sitting right up front as they presented their findings. Jason had been caught embezzling homeowners association funds. The board had gone through the finances after receiving anonymously provided evidence and found thousands of dollars in unauthorized transactions. By the end of the meeting, Jason was officially removed from the board. But it didn't end there. A group of homeowners, sick of years of corruption and selective enforcement, banded together to sue both Jason and Margaret. Margaret tried to cut her losses. Within a week, her house was up for sale. Jason, he wasn't so lucky. He had legal trouble now and a reputation as a con artist. The final nail in the coffin came a few weeks later. The new board voted to review and revise every single rule that had been unfairly enforced over the years. And the first thing they did, they reinstated my fence, the very one Margaret had torn down. Not only that, but they apologized publicly for the harassment I had endured. I stood in my backyard, looking at my freshly rebuilt cedar fence, taking in the sweet victory of it all. Margaret was gone, Jason was ruined, and me, I finally had peace. So, Reddit, tell me honestly, did I handle this situation the right way? Considering all the harassment, the illegal actions, and the years of injustice. Do you think I went too far, or was this a justified response to their abuse of power? I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives and whether you think there was a better way to handle this situation given what I went through with these neighbors.